So I've got one. So the final slide. So that was remember this is a study we did in 1979, and we measured some other things. And now, going back on these data, I believe I can identify that I had insulin resistance present at the age of 28 when I was lean. I was running 140 kilometers a week, and I was insulin resistant. And the point is that I'm trying to make is that we misdiagnose insulin resistance because we don't really understand what it is. So there the ketone bodies, we've discussed those. So here now are much more complex slides. Now, the ketone bodies are generated by free fatty acids, which are released from the fat cells, which then come back to the liver and then are converted to ketone bodies. And predictably, when we were eating the low carbohydrate diet, our free fatty acid levels went up to 2. And that is also regulated because you can't allow them to go too high. And when we had the high carbohydrate diet, the values went up to slightly lower. And when we rested, of course, they were there. Now, what's really interesting, because I didn't see this when I looked at the data in 1980, none of us realized that we were seeing a phenomenon. Now, here we see these are the blood glucose levels, and diabetes is diagnosed incorrectly if it's diagnosed very late. Once you're fasting glucose, that's when you fasted for 12 hours, the glucose goes up and is above 6.5. So if these values were above 6.5, in other words, those values weren't there, they were up here somewhere. So if those values were there, we wouldn't have a problem. We'd say that you have type 2 diabetes. Our values are normal. What happened next is as we exercised, they rose, and that is wrong. Blood glucose levels should be tightly regulated during exercise, and for both of us, they should have stayed normal, but they didn't. They rose up to a value of 6, which is very, very unusual. I didn't recognize it, although I saw it. But now you see when we eat the low carbohydrate diets, our glucose went up. Even though we hadn't eaten carbohydrates for 3 days, we were unable to regulate our carbohydrate blood glucose levels, and it only fell in the second hour of exercise, and then it was normal and dropped. So immediately, as I see that, I begin to wonder, can you detect insulin resistance in people by having them exercise and notice that their blood glucose isn't regulated? So that was the first, but then I noticed something even more interesting, and that is our insulin response. Now, when you have a normal insulin response, it should be below about 10. So these two values are normal. Those two values are normal, but this value is grossly abnormal. It's 3 times the normal. So when we did not do any exercise, for some reason, our insulin values were highly raised. And that is insulin resistance, and that's one of the ways we can detect it. It's a high resting insulin. So this, as you asked, advocate, you asked me, what's insulin resistance? You have to secrete more insulin to keep the glucose down. So here you see we've got normal glucoses, but the cost is we had to secrete more insulin. So it is my holding that we were both pre-diabetic, the 2 athletes that we studied. But we didn't realize it. We didn't realize we had insulin resistance. And that's why we're in such a predicament, is we underdiagnose the prevalence of insulin resistance and diabetes in our country. And we wait till the glucose goes up and all the other problems have happened. But this is when I'm 28 that I show this abnormality. So my theory is that insulin resistance is a genetic disorder that is present from birth. And we misdiagnose it. We wait till the person has got diabetes. And so that's the problem. And then again, look here, this insulin is still far too high. We haven't eaten all day and it's still very high. So my diagnosis is that Tim Nokes and friend have insulin resistance hyperinsulinemia despite youth and marathon training. It improved on the high-fat diet. It improved on the high-fat diet. When we went on the high-fat diet, low carbs, we were better. We didn't have as much insulin, so that was helping. And they must develop type 2 diabetes with time if they continue eating a high carbohydrate diet. And one of the talks will be on what's this condition of hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, from which I suffer, and which I will show is the most prevalent medical condition on planet Earth, but which is included in the medical curriculum and taught at few, if any, medical schools around the world. And I will argue that this is the most prevalent condition, and it's worsened by high carbohydrate diets. So we have the situation, we have a predisposing condition, insulin resistance, which we don't recognize. We underdiagnose it. It was underdiagnosed in me. And then we provide a dietary advice that makes it worse.
in your view, and having perused all of those articles and the research that goes in the formulation of those guidelines, do you believe that sufficient or any consideration was given to this highly prevalent condition of insulin resistance?
No, I don't think so. I think the guidelines are prescribed as if everyone has perfect insulin tolerance and can metabolize carbohydrate well. And that would be fine if the population was 100% insulin sensitive. I would have no problem with the dietary guidelines. But because they don't consider the individual with insulin resistance, and they completely continue to ignore the individual and what that person needs, then we have a problem. And I will show you why it is. It's because there has been a health washing of carbohydrates over the last 60 years. When people started to demonize fats, they had to make carbohydrates healthy. And I will show you that there's plenty of evidence that carbohydrates were not healthy. But because of the dietary guidelines in 1977 and the political influence that brought about those dietary guidelines, carbohydrates had to be health washed. And so we had to say these are going to be healthy for everyone. And that ignored the reality. And we're in the predicament we are today because we didn't understand that we're prescribing the wrong foods to people who can't metabolize carbohydrates successfully for 60, 70, 80 years.